Have you ever wondered, why do military parades exist? Why almost every armed forces around the world care for a proper parade? What does it represent? What is the reason behind it? And why is it so important to keep it going anyway? So what is actually a drill? Simply, a drill is just marching. Drill and ceremony is one of the first things soldiers learn when they enter the military. It helps develop pride and confidence in their actions, learning professionalism. And most importantly, it teaches them how to work as a team. In ancient times, the most powerful, efficient and developed empires developed ways of moving troops from one place to another without them getting mixed up with other troops. So they marched together from one place to another, also known as drill. The theory behind it was, without the formation and the drill, masses of soldiers would end up getting lost on the way to battle and have to fight with just any ally unit they could find instead of the unit they trained with. As time went on, a system of flags developed. These flags allowed soldiers to find their own units and side on the battlefield if they got lost. However, the military quickly discovered that sticking to formed units worked better as everyone was present when needed for battle. Overall, the drill system worked. Soldiers stayed together and could be commanded as a group. These days, military drill is mostly used for military ceremonies, such as military parades, and to instill pride and discipline during military training, such as basic training. In fact, the Military Drill Manual, a book about 6 inches thick, confidently states that drill is the foundation of discipline in battle and that its importance has been proven again and again. Synchronized behavior is a common feature of martial drills and military parades in many societies. Across widely diverse cultures and among societies of very different scales, synchronized behavior is a prominent feature of rituals and collective displays. Over the last 2 decades, a growing literature has explored the psychological effects of synchronized movement and synchronized sound production. The intentional enactment of synchronized behavior evolved as a means of signaling coalitional strength. Participation in synchrony is associated with positive effects and self-concepts linked to social bonding subjectively. Individuals find participation in synchrony rewarding, experience themselves as closer to their fellow synchronizers, and are thus motivated to both aid their fellows and act in concert with them. Synchronized behaviors signal elevated fighting capacity.
Marching served a purpose recognized through history,
said Daniel M.T. Fessler, an evolutionary anthropologist at the University of California, Los Angeles. Fessler and a colleague, Colin Holbrook, just published a paper in the journal Biology Letters on marching into battle. The people marching, the in-group, get one message. The people they are marching toward, the out-group, get another. Almost every army does it, he said. And so do many police forces as well. There is the famous Archibald MacNeil Willard painting of 3 American soldiers during the Revolution, one with a flag, one with a fife, the third with a drum leading a march. Fessler said the British Army, dressed in bright red and gold, marched to combat during the war and were cut down by Americans wearing camouflage and hiding behind trees. That was essentially the last time an army used that tactic. However, marching remains part of training until today. Marching clearly builds unit cohesion, he said. It builds confidence in fighting ability. When units of the British Army marched into various wars with bagpipes and drums leading the march, they were not doing it just because of tradition. It is part of an evolved psychology. Fessler believes any vertebrate can make decisions on potential threat from size and strength. For example, back in 2002 and 2003, when the North Koreans claimed that they were developing nuclear weapons, they conducted a huge number of public military parades, receiving lots of attention from the press, which commended them on how modern and disciplined their military was. The North Korean forces could clearly be seen to be skilled, which would act as a deterrent against many lesser military forces. The use of synchronized behavior as a demonstration of strength is not universal in the animal world, but it exists. Anthropologists call it convergent evolution. The same attribute evolves independently in different species. Tons of animals do it, said Mark Bekoff, also an evolutionary biologist at the University of Colorado. Boulder including chimpanzees, coyotes, wolves, and elephants. In birds it's called mobbing, Bekoff said. Dolphins may be the best example of synchronous behavior. Mature male dolphins will often form gangs that act in consort, said Richard Connor, a biologist at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth. Sometimes a gang will raid another group of dolphins to steal females, particularly those ready to reproduce. They will defend themselves from attacks by other gangs who want the females. Sometimes one gang will ally itself with another to build a more formidable force, again acting in synchrony. Today, regular parades in public display the military as a highly trained, disciplined and professional force. Even though the parade itself doesn't provide any useful function on the battlefield, it instills public confidence in the nation's military forces. After all, weaker members of the group are emboldened by the stronger members of the group when they act together, whether in dolphin gangs, armies, or police forces.